couldn't help but to think about so many of the people that I know that went to elite schools and went to private schools and went to Ivy League schools, checked all the boxes just to report to somebody that got to where they are because they knew somebody. Welcome to the Rich and Regular podcast, where we explore life at the intersection of money. I'm Julian.
And I'm Kirsten. And today we're talking about how to know if you can actually afford private school.
All right.
Getting a little controversial. But first, I want to say I missed y'all last week. But hopefully you caught us on our other podcast, or I should say another podcast that we are co-hosting this season. We have partnered with AAA Northeast on their podcast called Merging into Life. And as of today, I think there are 2 of our 3 episodes that are live. So go check them out. I'm going to leave the link in the show notes. And then I want to shout out to Crystal Black 4870 on YouTube, who left a comment on a recent episode about how to tell if you could afford your car, very similar vibes, and said, as a self-identified car whore, her words, not mine, I spent a lot of funds on car trades and new rides. 2020 actually helped me realize I needed to find my long-time car and pay it off ASAP. My 15-year-old just got his learners and was convinced that he needed a Tesla for his first car.
Of course.
Then I started making him calculate the cost of that Tesla, the insurance for that car, and the cost of repairs. And that idea died pretty quick, especially since he doesn't have a job yet. However, it's been rough to find a used car in a reasonable price range for a kid. $5,000 used is the new $500 hoopty. And that is facts.
I like that.
That is facts.
Well,
it is.
Except for calling yourself a car whore. That's pretty harsh.
I mean, I think she meant it in the affirming way, but.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But yes, it is hard to find used cars. What has helped is just driving around. A lot of people are selling them themselves. So they'll just put a sign in the window. And then Facebook Marketplace, surprisingly, has some great deals for used cars.
Yeah, if you can get past the creepy factor, you can definitely find some good deals on cars and Lord knows just about anything on Facebook Marketplace. All right, so let's get into this topic of conversation. This is one that I have never thought about up until now.
Really?
Yeah. Private school was not something that was a part of my thought process as a kid. It was always public school and go to college, but it was a different time, different area, different community. What about you? Did you ever think about it, or do you have friends that went to private school?
Oh, yeah. My college roommate went to private school. Now, when I was young, most of my friends were public school kids, and then the rest were church friends who just went to different public schools. But as I got into college, I realized how many people in my college group went to a private school.
Yeah. I didn't really start to meet those people until I got into certain heights of my corporate career. That's when I started to realize that there was a subgenre of people, if you will, that sort of matriculated a different path than some of these regular folks out here. But there are a couple of reasons why we really wanted to talk about this. Obviously, depending on where you are in the country, it's back to school time. It's always kind of part of the vibe that a lot of people are thinking of. And for some people, that means bringing their kids back to private school or might be starting private school. But also, if you've been listening to our podcast or just kind of following us on social media, we are very much in the travel baseball kind of chapter of our life. Our son is very much a baseball kid. And through that, we've learned that a lot of kids on the team are private school kids. It's just really interesting, and it kind of feeds into the idea that baseball, in a way, or travel baseball, is a bit of an elitist, club, if you will. But we're not going to get into that. 2 other reasons why we wanted to talk about this. One, because this is just the state of the times that we're in. There are a lot of people who are struggling right now. And, we've been talking about that from a standpoint of saving on travel to saving on, your car, or just trying to find other ways to cut back. And a lot of people are really making that difficult decision right now to say, you know what, I don't know that the juice is worth the squeeze for us anymore. And that tends to be one of those things that you really, really want to hold on to as long as possible. And I know for a fact there is somebody who is listening to this right now and is wondering oh shit, does that mean we might be on the edge? But the last reason why I want us to talk about this really goes back to the big, beautiful bill, which was passed by Congress. This is a big Trump plan, something that he was very proud of. And there was a lot in that bill, but one of the biggest things was the emergence of the conversation around a national voucher program. I'm not going to go into all the details about that. That is a podcast in and of itself, but basically it's making private schools more accessible, basically for people who can kind of already afford it, if you will. Like they're basically
Upper
going to
and middle class
receive a
households.
credit on their private school tuitions, basically based off of like their charitable contributions and those kinds of things. And so there's obviously a lot of pushback because what that will likely do, according to certain critics, is that it's going to make private school even less accessible by making it even more expensive, right? So you've got all this money coming in. A lot of people are now expressing interest. These for-profit institutions are naturally going to want to raise prices. This has happened before. And so a lot of people are saying this is essentially going to happen again. And so all of that to say, if you are one of those families who are on the edge, this is likely something that you are bracing for because maybe it was already expensive. And I know quite a few people who are in that weird place where they're doing it. They have their reasons and their rationales for wanting to do it, but they recognize how expensive it is. The reality is things might be getting a little bit more expensive if a lot of this stuff goes through.
Yeah, I think the families on the edge is the reason I wanted to talk about this. I recognize that the bill was passed and that creates all kinds of discourse around private education. But like we said at the top of the episode, this is a controversial topic. The families who invest in private education believe strongly in it. And this episode is not intended to try to convince you to do something else. It's not to say that all private education is bad, but there is a large group of people in the middle that are struggling with a decision for one reason or another, whether it's financial or emotional or just the logistical toll of getting kids to and from. And this is really just about talking about it in an open space. Like you said, a lot of the kids on Bo's baseball team attend a private school, and I've had some private, pun intended, conversations with their moms or their parents. And a lot of the stuff that we're discussing right now is stuff that has come up privately, but it doesn't feel like a safe thing to say. So I figured we should just rip the Band-Aid off and talk about it and, you know, express what we would say to you if you were coming to us as just like your smart friend who wants to vent or just get a different perspective on a decision that you've made. Now, we know lots of people make the decision for private school for different reasons. But one of the ways I want to start talking about the conversation is just objectively in the fact that it is not free for most people.
No.
There is a cost when it comes to private school. In fact, the average national private school tuition in the US for 2025 is around $14,913 per year, with high school being a little over almost $18,000. So we've got almost $15,000 and almost $18,000, which I would say is still a little bit misleading. Like I would think of that as like the base cost, but not the full cost of sending your child through this experience.
Yeah.
There are also hidden costs, or maybe they're not hidden, but they're lesser discussed because they're variable and somewhat discretionary or optional. But I'll categorize them into three different buckets. There's your core tuition, there's extracurriculars, and then there's like a social cost. So core tuition is what we just explained. It's the mandatory enrollment and registration fees. Now, typically those numbers I just quoted don't include any fees like application fees, registration fees, all the fees that you need to have just to get in, like just to apply.
College fees.
Yeah.
Like in my mind,
there's a fee for running your credit report.
Fees.
Yeah. You want financial aid? Okay. Well, there's a fee associated with like getting your finances and having them look at them. Then there's technology fees for any required devices or software. And there's fundraising contributions, which we'll get into in just a second. So that's just core tuition. And then in terms of extracurriculars, there's specialized equipment. So a lot of private schools are known for all of their extracurriculars and clubs. So things like hockey gear, musical instruments, uniforms, travel for competitions, private coaching, lessons. All of these things are in addition to your tuition. The school offers them, but participating usually has a different cost on top of the baseline cost. And then there is the social costs, which are school fundraisers, and there are a lot. And even optional donations are expected to be substantial. Every kid typically gets like a goal that they have to set, or the classroom gets a goal. And this is true in public school as well. But the numbers for private school are much, much bigger. They have class trips. They have spirit wear and gear. They have all sorts of additional things that come with just being a part of that club, which is essentially what it is. Like, it's no different from joining Soho Club or some other exclusive country club. There are signs of membership, and those signs and signals that signify, like, oh, I go to this academy or I go to this school, have an extra cost to them. So when you factor that all in, you've got your base cost, but then every month you've got a couple $100 trickling out here and there for, different extracurriculars or spiritware or trips or fundraising. You're going to have to ask the grandparents to send their check. Like, as someone who's been to a grand day at a private school for one of our family members, it's very like Price is Right. Like, it's a very intense situation to see a couple hundred families raise, $1 million
Oh yeah.
in an evening for the purposes of offsetting tuition. And it's like, oh, there's still tuition on top of that. That's just to like offset financial aid.
It's really interesting because it brought me back to a lot of the kind of silent auction fundraisers that we would attend on a pretty regular basis when we were in our corporate world. But even as you were going through the numbers, I was thinking like, oh, I totally understand why a 2 household income that are both high earners would completely send their kids to private school and, kind of flippantly bypass it, because I get it. There's some people who say that, hell no, $18,000, there's no way. And then there are other families who say, well, no, I get it. If it means that they're going to get a good education and it essentially puts them on the right path. Like, I literally see both sides. It's not for us, right? Based on where we are at this point in our life. But I think that the conversation around private school is very similar to the conversation around youth sports, right? Like, it's always a matter of like either or. I think you can do a little bit of both, right? That for me, generally speaking, the answer is always going to be somewhere in the middle. And I think in this case, when we're talking about private schools, you're absolutely right. It's not just that top line number, that big tuition number, very similar to college, right? It's that plus the 10 to 15 fees below that, plus all of the other kind of invisible costs, if you will, that tend to pop up. But I want to put this in perspective because that is also true for the other options. And by the other options, I mean public school and homeschooling. And just to put the population in perspective, according to recent research, only 10% of kids in the United States attend private school. 85%, the vast majority, attend public school. And then that last 5% are homeschooled kids. And as I was saying,
which is a growing number,
right? For a variety of reasons, right? So this idea of there being hidden or secondary costs is not something that is unique to private school. But what is unique to private school is that tuition and that big old check that comes with it. That does not come with public school and certainly not with homeschool. All of that to say, those are your options, but we want to present, or at least just spend a little bit of time talking about the alternative. And I tried to find it, but it was a really, really great infographic that I saw on LinkedIn a few months ago. And it was something that I thought of all the time because, again, private school is not something that's been top of mind. We've spoken about homeschool more than we've spoken about private school. And I've always been of the belief that what if you just invested that money instead, right? Like, if you can afford $18,000 a year, I think you owe it to yourself to ask the question, what if we invested that money instead? So instead of cutting a check to a private school institution, let's just use simple math here. If you started at age 5 and you went all the way to 18, we're talking about a 13-year period, not the longest amount of time. But using that simple math, you're basically cutting a check for around $200,000 just in tuition. We know there's going to be more than that. You could round up to 250, whatever it is. But if we're just talking about tuition, using those numbers and using that time frame, we're looking at around $200,000. And if you had decided to invest that money instead, assuming conservative growth at around 8%, you can expect at the end of that child's high school experience, you'd have around $322,000, which is a pretty sizable gift, I would say, for the vast majority of high school kids. And of course, if you just allowed that money to compound, that kid would be sitting on around $3.2 million by the time they were 50. Of course, if you allow it to sit even further, that money just continues to grow and grow. And so that, to me, is a really, really interesting way of looking at it. And again, there was an infographic that really kind of combed through all of those different options and all of the different pathways. And they both ended with these two different options. One was a kid holding a nice, shiny diploma from a private school who was now looking for a job. versus a kid who might also be looking for a job, but has the benefit of having $300,000 in their pocket. And if they wanted to use that as startup capital for a business, if they wanted to take a year off and maybe travel the world or do whatever it is that they wanted, or if they just wanted to pursue a career, for lack of a better word, in a field that they knew was not going to be one where they would demand a high income, they might actually be okay with that because they know they basically prepaid, or their parents had prepaid for their retirement. And so I just think it was a really interesting way of presenting an alternative, because typically we just hear about private school, public school, or homeschool, but we don't think about this hybrid approach where we're saying you could also just choose to spend the money or invest the money differently and put yourself or your child in a completely different situation than most kids would be, regardless of the educational path that they take.
I always love questions that are like, what if you just invested it instead? I feel like the older you get, the less the latte factor makes sense,
For
where people
sure.
are like, oh, what if you just save the $5? But decisions like this are really important to look at through that lens, because it's a lot of money.
It
It's a
is.
lot of money. It's enough to make sure that that kid doesn't have any college debt. It's enough to make sure that, to your point, if they wanted to buy a home somewhere, they have a down payment. Like, it solves so many other future issues versus just like US history, geometry, and whether you understand algebra in a certain way at a certain age, through high school. But let's just say that you can technically afford it. Like, let's say that you are able to write the check. I want to make it clear that being able to write a check doesn't mean that it's affordable, at least not the way that we define affording something. Even in our book, we talk about how important it is to not just ask yourself if you can afford something, but to also ask yourself at what cost. Because if the rest of your life is shrinking just to make that check possible, it's worth reevaluating the decision. We've talked to so many parents who are cash flowing $25,000 a year for tuition for their 2 kids, but they're delaying retirement, or they feel like they're working just to pay those invoices. And that's not sustainable, because that changes the way that you show up for your kids. That changes the way that they feel about education and what is a good education if they've never had a chance to sample or try something else.
It changes the relationship that you have with your partner, because I can assure you there's going to be a lot of tension in the air. If a kid brings home a bad grade and you know that you guys are basically living on the edge to get this kid through this program, and I'm saying kid, right? Like, we're just talking about one.
Right.
We're just assuming it's one, but there are certainly lots of families out there who may have multiple children in this situation. Like, this is a very expensive path to go down.
It is. And it's much easier to believe that if your kid is on scholarship, or if you are someone who got your tuition subsidized either through a voucher program or some other, incentive, that it's still a win-win. But there are still all of those external costs that we talked about. So it's still not free. And then there is the psychological impact of being the not rich kid among all of the rich kids.
See, I didn't know that we were going to get into that.
Which we don't.
I want to avoid that conversation. I'm going to let you finish. Well, I have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real thing, though. It's a real thing. Even if you took rich out of it, there's the smart kid around like other smart kids effect. They said that when kids go to Harvard, the number one signal of whether you succeed or fail is how confident you feel being around a room full of smart kids. Doesn't mean that you're not smart, but when you're in a room full of smart kids, especially really smart kids from across the globe, you suddenly feel less smart. And the same is true with money. You put people in a room full of kids whose parents are owners of sports teams or CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, and you're not that, it absolutely has a psychological effect.
Yeah. And go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I'll say this, they will say, but my kid now has a network of people who are the future doctors and lawyers and engineers and vice presidents and leaders of companies and those kinds of things. I just do not have a lot of evidence of that working out well for those groups of kids. I don't have that many. What I do have are examples of kids who might have had parents who made that sacrifice to put them into those kinds of programs or institutions, and then they strike out as entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
But what I don't see a lot of are examples of people who don't come from wealth, who go into these institutions, suddenly build networks with people who do come from wealth, and then all of a sudden are on that path together. It is elitist for a reason. It is a closed invisible door. That's just been my experience, right? I'm
Yeah,
just basing that off of the people that I know, the stories that I've heard. I try my best to see both sides, but
I
to
do see
me,
both
it
sides.
is still disproportionately a closed world, if you will. Like, you can come to the school, you can get your education, but to assume that you will naturally just be rolled into the network as if you had already been there is a bit ambitious. And so I
Yes.
think you've got to your point, think about the psychological cost of a kid struggling with a feeling of inferiority, if you will, because there are just certain things that they cannot relate to, that they just have certainly never experienced. And that can be really damaging.
I think this is such an interesting point, and this is the last thing I say because I don't want the episode to diverge into this path. But you're right, because I think when it comes to the ultra wealthy, the super wealthy, the like very rich, when you look at their life experience, the network that they get from school is just one of many networks. That is one shared experience, but they also have a network from their vacations. They also have a network from their churches, fundraisers, communities, careers. And so the idea that the school network is going to be the one that's most prioritized because you believe that the children spend the most time in school and so they'll be best friends with their classmates is ambitious. And it's also a little optimistic because there are far more fun environments that these kids get to spend in because of their family's success that actually take precedent in terms of the networks that they nurture and manage over time. The other side of that is that in communities like ours, now we don't live in the most affluent community in Atlanta, and our son goes to a public school and has gone to like a regular daycare. Like, he's been in regular school since he's been school aged. And he's gone to school with several public figures' children. So people you would consider very rich, very wealthy, very well known, athletes, musicians, business owners, the rich and regular among us. And they send their kids to public schools for the opposite reason, because they actually want their kids to get more grounded
A
and
more
more experience.
normalized experience, not one that is so completely removed from the realities of the
Exactly.
world.
And I only bring that up because this idea that a network of successful kids and families only being available at private schools is something that we really need to move past, because there are lots of normal, successful people who go to public schools as well.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about networks and almost like the status element of why people choose to default to private schools. But there's a couple of other reasons that I want to go over because I have another point. The first one is just around safety and environment. So a lot of people choose private schools because they have these smaller class sizes. Like, some of the kids on Bo's team have like 12 kids in their class, and it's the same 12 from the year before, versus he has, 23 in his class. It's a big class. They also have these gated campuses, there's limited access. Sometimes there's better funding for security protocols. And so it just feels safer, feels like a better environment. The second reason that people might choose private school is because they want a values or culture alignment. Like, sometimes people want faith-based education, or, they believe that private charter schools offer more structure. And then the third reason is that people think that they're designing a life of specialized training. And so they hope that their kid gets a better shot because they have provided and put him in or her into this school and paid for a very specialized type of education. I just want to point out that there are several public school models or options that solve for so many of the same reasons that people choose private school. We have magnet and charter schools, which solve for the environment issue because they tend to be smaller and more controlled. There are gifted programs, IB programs, dual enrollment, language immersion. All of these solve for advanced curriculum in a public school format. Then there's also STEM schools, performance arts schools, if you want something more specialized. And so this idea, again, that you have to pay in order to get these little tidbits is another outdated idea. There's still an application to get into these things. You might have to qualify to get into these programs, but it's no different than what you would have to do at a private school. So,
Yeah, to your point, I get it. I try my best to see both sides. I think there are several other reasons. You didn't mention legacy, but I think
oh
for
yeah,
sure that's one of the number one
and
reasons.
trauma.
Right. Like, there are tons of reasons why, like I can totally see why you would absolutely say, hell no, there's no way I'm going to send my kid to a public school. I completely get it. Everyone has their own list and prioritizes or sort of stacks those reasons in a way that is unique to them. I do want to focus on the end goal though, because presumably, aside from status, the idea is that by getting a better education, you now put your child in a better position to get the best jobs, right? Like getting the best jobs. And the goal of getting the best jobs is ultimately to build a stronger or better financial future. I just want to go back to that alternative as well, right? Because there is still a pathway to get there. Like if the money is not an issue, but you don't want to go through the long list of other considerations that oftentimes come with putting a child in these kinds of institutions, you still have that option. And oh, by the way, it's not $15,000 or nothing. Right.
Right.
If you can only, I'm using air quotes here, if you can only afford to invest $5,000 to $10,000, you're still putting your child way, way, way ahead. Right. And so if the idea is that you can just invest for your child so that they have a nice nest egg by the time they graduate, and if they have the need or the desire to spend that money right then and there, they can, or they can simply allow that money to compound. And ultimately, you've set them up for a financial future. The other pathway is to pay for an education, which presumably comes with the promise of getting a good job, which they're going to have to fight for, especially in a world of AI reducing jobs and making jobs even much more competitive. But even before we get to the actual job hunt, we have to get through college. And that's a whole other issue. A couple of things happening there. One, college is still wildly expensive and it's very difficult to predict how expensive it's going to be. Two, you have this consolidation of schools. And so they're getting even harder to get into. I think it's as of March 2020, there are 45 public or private nonprofit schools or campuses that have closed or are announcing closures. We've spoken about the enrollment cliff, which is this huge drop off, which basically means that there are fewer and fewer people even applying to colleges these days. Obviously, there's a student loan debt crisis. You've got AI reducing jobs. You've got terrible labor markets and all these kinds of things. And so as I'm churning through this process, I just see a lot of holes in it. It's like we're paying for a premium for an education to presumably get jobs that we don't even know are going to be there, but we certainly know are going to be significantly harder to get. And if you do get them, the goal is that you can pay off any debts or anything that you've incurred during that time period and can then start investing so that you can save for your financial future. And it's like, well, that just seems like a really long-winded way to get to the same end goal, short of this known pathway of status and legacy and those kinds of things. And so I just want to really, really reinforce that as an option, because I know that a lot of people don't think about it that way, because we are very much trained to just think about jobs and, status and having fields of study that then turn into a occupation or a profession. But I just want to make sure that the end goal ultimately is to build wealth.
Yeah.
And there are other ways that you can get there that do not involve you having to do any of these things or incurring any of the other costs that are associated with private school.
I think that's part of the dilemma, because once you put your kid in private school, it's very hard to rationalize pulling them out, even though that decision needs to be on the table in the same way that selling your house needs to be on the table or selling your car needs to be on the table. You have invested in this social environment, and you don't realize when you start how long of an investment it is and how much of the time and money that it's going to take, especially in a world where things are changing so quickly. You mentioned AI taking jobs. There's also the idea of income instability for people who already have jobs, like not even talking about the future of jobs. I'm talking about the right now of jobs. Layoffs have already superseded 2024 numbers in 2025. And so there's a lot of people that are dealing with that. On top of that, studies show that once you control for family income and education, the academic outcomes between public school and private school narrow dramatically. So there's not much of a difference once you control for like the family that these kids come from.
Yeah, it's the same conversation that I had between, what are considered normal or regular colleges and Ivy League colleges.
Yes. And on top of that, multiple studies, including some from Harvard, from Johns Hopkins, from very esteemed institutions, confirm that parental engagement is one of the strongest predictors of student success, regardless of what type of school they go to. And so if you sit with that for a second, if you level the playing field for income and education, the test scores are pretty similar. When you look at what actually moves the needles for kids, it's not tuition, it's you, it's involvement, it's attention, it's time, it's you actually giving your child what they need. We've been sold this idea that school itself is the biggest factor, but there's nothing more powerful in terms of outcomes than the parent. And so I guess the real question isn't, can I afford private school? It's really about what kind of investor am I willing to be in my child's life?
Yeah.
And it's not just talking about money, it's talking about time, attention, love, all of the things that AI is not going to be able to replicate, all the things that are going to matter in 15 years, like emotional intelligence and learning agility and creativity. All of that stuff is our job. You can't outsource that. You can't cut a check for that. And so if you are someone on the edge and trying to decide whether you pull your kids out or whether to enroll them or whether we should be saving for this, I want you to ask yourself three things. The first one is, what problem am I trying to solve by choosing private school? The second one is there a public or lower cost option that could meet that need with more support from me? So you have to include yourself in that formula. You can't just say, will it meet the need? I can just drop them off and that's all that there is. It's like, no, like, if I get involved more, is there a way that I can still meet that need using a public or a lower cost option? And then the third question is, if I do spend the money, what am I giving up and am I okay with that? And don't just tell me like you're not giving up nothing. There's an opportunity cost every time we spend a dollar. So think about what you're actually giving up when you decide to allocate that $15,000 or $17,000 a year for however long you're going to do that.
Yeah. I had to remind myself that I am also the author of Cashing Out When the Wealth Came by Walking Away, which looks at money and wealth and our careers at the intersection of race. And I didn't really intend on even going there because that's not really what this conversation was about. But I couldn't help but to think about so many of the people that I know that went to elite schools and went to private schools and went to Ivy League schools and did well in their careers, but they still reported to people who did not. And by that, I mean, not people of color, right? So we did all that, checked all the boxes, went to all of the elite schools just to report to somebody that got to where they are because they knew somebody. And so there are barriers that I just don't think there are some institutions can break through. Doesn't matter what you have. And I'm talking about the highest level. And it's not just one. I mean, I know at least 4 examples of people who've went to the best of the best of the best. And they still did not make it beyond certain levels of the corporate ladder because other things and other factors were at play there. And so that's just not a game that I think is sustainable. And I certainly don't think it's a game that prioritizes your own emotional well-being, not to mention your own financial future or your children's financial future. And so it's something to think about. And I have no problem being a little bit biased here because it is our show and we can say whatever we want. But I do think if you're that family that is on the edge, if we're so bold to say, get rid of your fancy car, get rid of your house that you know is too big and consider moving on to a different part of town, I think this absolutely has to be part of the consideration because now is the time. If you're feeling the pressure, now is the time. You're likely just finding other reasons to say or convince yourself that this is something that is not on the table. And to Kirsten's point, there are other questions that you need to ask yourself. And it's like, at what cost? At what real cost am I so willing to just not do this? And I want to give a shout out to a friend, and they had the courage. I ran into them today. They had the courage to pull the trigger for at least one of their children. And I think they're getting ready to do it again for a second one. And so, you're not alone, right? There are plenty of families that have done this. I don't know the full details, but I would imagine, just based on some of the sidebar conversations, it was like, I like the school, but I don't like the price tag, right? And there's something to be said about that, right? Like if you can't see, looking at your kid and looking at other kids, that they have some significant benefit or privilege or something like that these other kids don't have, kudos to them for asking themselves the question whether or not this is worth it. And they pull that trigger, and I would imagine they feel really, really good about saving however many $1,000 they did this month, and will continue to do that for the foreseeable future. So shout out to them. They don't know that I'm talking about them, but
they probably do now. But you're right. They're not alone. One of my hairstylists, she did the same thing for her kids a couple years ago. And has never been happier. She was like, this is great. Like, it's the same kid. Like, my kid did not change. They actually have more fun now. So there's always two sides to every pancake. So take what you can, use some of the questions to have a conversation that you have been avoiding, even if it's just with yourself at first versus with your partner or any other decision makers, and then report back per usual. All right, y'all. Well, thank you for listening to another episode of the Rich and Regular podcast. If you like what you heard, please let us know by leaving a 5-star rating or review on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Make sure you check out Merging into Life or drop a comment below to keep the conversation going. We will see y'all next week. If you like videos like this and want to see more, make sure you click subscribe and turn on notifications.